Hey guys, tonight we begin with something a little darker. A time of plagues, punishments, and pottage by stepping back 7 centuries to a world so fundamentally different from our own that the very air you breathed would taste foreign on your tongue. We're diving into what life was really like during the Middle Ages. Forget the castles and chivalry Hollywood sold you. The truth, you probably wouldn't last a single day. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you are settling in, drop a comment telling me where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. I love knowing that somewhere, someone in Tokyo is drifting off to tales of ancient scams, while someone else in Ohio is just starting their day with stories of historical foolishness. Now, dim the lights, maybe light a candle for that authentic. Settle deep in your pillow tonight, let your breathing deeply of your clean, modern air. Let your muscles release their tension. Let your mind begin to wander. Let the past rise softly around you, like distant smoke on the steps. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Settle yourself comfortably now, and allow your mind to drift backward, past the electric hum of modern life, past the Industrial Revolution's smoke and steam, past the age of exploration and discovery, to a time when the sun and moon governed the rhythm of existence more absolutely than any clock. You're about to discover why the medieval world, that sprawling tapestry of centuries we call the Middle Ages, would challenge every assumption you hold about daily survival. Not through dragons or knights in shining armor, but through the quiet, relentless realities that shaped every waking moment of medieval life. The simple act of finding something safe to drink. The challenge of staying warm when winter winds howled through gaps in walls. The careful negotiation required just to walk down a village street without a fence. Tonight, we'll walk in the footsteps of ordinary people who lived extraordinary lives, not because they sought adventure, but because survival itself was an adventure. We'll breathe the air they breathed, thick with smoke and human proximity. We'll feel the weight of their concerns pressing against our modern sensibilities. And perhaps, as your eyelids grow heavy, you'll find a new appreciation for the simple miracle of turning a handle and having clean water flow. Let us begin this gentle exploration in the place where most medieval lives unfolded. Not in castles or cathedrals, but in the humble, earth-scented world of the medieval village. Imagine yourself waking not to the soft chime of an alarm, but to the low, resonant toll of the church bell cutting through the pre-dawn darkness. The sound rolls across thatched roofs still heavy with dew, calling the faithful to lauds, the first prayer service of the day. But you, like most villagers, will not answer this call. Your day begins not with prayer, but with the more pressing matter of coaxing life back into the dying embers of your hearth. The air in your small dwelling is thick and close, heavy with the breath of your family and the lingering smoke from yesterday's fire. There are no windows as you know them, perhaps a small opening covered with oiled cloth or wooden shutters, but nothing that would let in the sharp morning air without also inviting unwanted visitors of the two-legged variety. The darkness is nearly complete, broken only by the faint glow of coals you've carefully banked beneath ash to preserve them through the night. Your feet touch not warm floorboards, but packed earth, perhaps scattered with rushes that have grown musty and need changing. The rushes crackle softly underfoot as you make your way carefully through the familiar geography of your home. You know every obstacle. The low beam that catches the unwary, the loose stone near the door, the place where water seeps through the wall when the rains are heavy. The first task, always the first task, is fire. Without it, there is no warmth, no cooked food, no light to dress by. You kneel beside the hearth, your knees pressing into the cold stone, and breathe gently onto the buried coals. A faint orange glow rewards your effort. Carefully, reverently almost, you add small pieces of kindling, precious scraps of dry wood you've hoarded for this moment. The fire catches with a soft whisper, and suddenly your world expands from arm's length to the boundaries of the small room. By this flickering light, you can see your family beginning to stir. Your spouse shifts on the straw mattress, pulling the rough woolen blanket closer. Your children, if you have them, are huddled together for warmth, their breath visible in small puffs in the cold air. The temperature inside your home differs little from the temperature outside. Walls of wood and clay, a roof of thatch, these provide shelter from rain and wind, but they are not the sealed, heated environment you're accustomed to. As the fire grows stronger, you begin the careful process of preparing for the day. Water must be fetched from the well, if you're fortunate enough to live in a village with a well. Otherwise, it's a walk to the stream, carrying heavy wooden buckets that will leave your shoulders aching. The water itself requires constant vigilance. Is it clear? Does it smell right? Even the cleanest looking water might carry illness, and you've learned to trust your nose and eyes as much as any modern person trusts a laboratory test. This water serves multiple purposes throughout the day. Some will be heated for washing, though washing means something different than you might expect. A quick splash of cold water on face and hands, perhaps. A more thorough washing of hands before eating, if you're particularly fastidious. The medieval body was not the daily scrub temple we're accustomed to. Soap, when available, was harsh and expensive. Most cleaning was done with cold water and rough cloth, leaving skin red and chapped. While you tend to these morning preparations, the village around you is stirring to life. Through your walls, thin enough that privacy is more concept than reality, you can hear your neighbors beginning their own daily rituals. The sound of axes biting into wood as men split kindling. The soft lowing of cattle as they're led from their overnight shelter to pasture. The creak of rope and wood as the baker's assistant works the well sweep, drawing up water for the day's bread. The smell of the village at dawn is a complex tapestry that would overwhelm modern senses. Would smoke, certainly, rising from dozens of chimneys and hearths. But underneath that, the earthier sense of human habitation lived at close quarters. The midden pits where household waste accumulates. The animal pens where livestock spend their nights. The lingering smell of tallow candles, made from animal fat, with their distinctive smoky sweetness. And through it all, the smell of cooking begins to assert itself. Porridge, thick, filling, made from whatever grain the harvest provided. Barley, perhaps, or oats. Rye if the harvest was particularly good. The grain is cooked long and slow, stretched with whatever can be found. Herbs from the kitchen garden if they survive the winter. A bone with some meat still clinging to it, if fortune has smiled upon your household. Your clothing, as you dress by firelight, tells the story of your place in the world. The fabric is rough, wool mostly scratchy against skin that has learned to tolerate what modern flesh would find unbearable. The colors are muted, natural dyes faded by wear and washing. Brown, gray, undyed natural wool colors. Perhaps a touch of madder red if you've prospered, or welled yellow if you've been particularly careful with your household budget. The clothing itself is practical above all else. Long tunics that can be hiked up for work, secured with a rope or leather belt. Hose that tie at the waist, providing warmth and protection for legs that will spend long hours in cold, damp conditions. A cloak or mantle for warmth, heavy enough to shed rain but not so heavy as to impede movement. Every piece of clothing represents hours of work. Spinning, weaving, cutting, sewing. and is mended and remended until the original fabric is barely recognizable. As you step outside into the growing light, the village reveals itself in the pearl gray dawn. Houses huddle together along paths that are more suggestion than engineering. In dry weather, these paths are dust that works its way into every crease of clothing, every fold of skin. In wet weather, they become mud that sucks at your feet and splashes up to stain everything it touches. The houses themselves seem to crouch against the earth, their thatched roofs giving them the appearance of great sleeping animals. Smoke rises from holes in the roofs, carrying with it the smell of breakfast and the promise of warmth. Gardens stretch behind houses, not the ornamental gardens you might imagine, but practical plots where onions and leeks, herbs and cabbages grow in careful rows that represent the difference between adequate nutrition and slow hunger. The church dominates the village, its stone walls and tower rising above the wooden and clay structures like a permanent reminder of hierarchy and eternity. The bell that woke you continues its measured calling, marking not just the hours of prayer, but the rhythm of community life. Church bells serve as the village's timekeeper, its emergency alarm, its call to assembly. Around the church, the more prosperous houses of the village arrange themselves. The priest's house, perhaps the miller's, the reeve who manages the Lord's local affairs. These houses are larger, their walls sometimes stone rather than wood and clay, their roofs sometimes tile rather than thatch. But even prosperity is relative in this world. The grandest house in the village would seem cramped and crude by modern standards. As the morning progresses and more people emerge from their homes, the village begins to reveal its complex social rhythms. You nod to your neighbors, exchange brief words about the weather, the crops, the health of livestock. These conversations serve purposes beyond mere pleasantry. They're the way information travels in a world without rapid communication. News of illness, of travelers on the road, of changes in the Lord's household, all pass from mouth to mouth in the space of morning greetings. The miller's wheel begins to turn as the stream carries away the night's accumulation of water, and the rhythmic grinding of grain creates a steady heartbeat for the village. Women begin to appear at the well, their wooden buckets bumping against their legs as they walk, their voices carrying across the morning air in conversations that have remained essentially unchanged for centuries. Concerns about children, about food, about the small dramas that make up the texture of community life. Men gather near the fields that stretch beyond the village, their conversation turning to the endless concerns of agricultural life. The condition of the soil, the prospects for rain, the health of the Lord's crops that they'll tend before their own. Their hands, already rough from yesterday's work, flex around the handles of tools that have been passed down through generations. And you, standing in this morning light, breathing this wood smoke-scented air, listening to these voices that speak in accents you'd struggle to understand, begin to realize how every aspect of survival requires knowledge and skills that have been lost to modern life. The ability to judge weather by the color of clouds, to know by touch whether bread is properly kneaded, to read the subtle signs that indicate whether a neighbor is struggling and might need help, or whether they might be prospering beyond their admitted means. The sun, climbing higher now, begins to warm the earth and set the day's true work in motion. But already, in these first hours after dawn, you've navigated challenges that would exhaust a modern person. Keeping fire alive, securing clean water, dressing in the dark, stepping into a social world where every interaction carries weight and consequence. This is just the beginning of your medieval day, and already the gap between your world and theirs has revealed itself in countless small ways. The constant presence of cold and dampness, the scarcity that makes every resource precious, the way community and survival interweave until they become indistinguishable. As the sun climbs higher, painting the village in shades of amber and gold, the true rhythm of medieval life begins to assert itself. This is not the gentle awakening of a world cushioned by convenience, but the urgent stirring of a community where every moment of daylight represents opportunity that cannot be wasted. You join the stream of villagers moving toward the fields, your footsteps joining a chorus that has echoed along these same paths for generations. The earth beneath your feet tells the story of countless journeys, worn smooth in some places, rutted and treacherous in others where cartwheels have carved permanent scars during muddy seasons. The fields themselves stretch before you like a great manuscript written in furrows and grain. But this is not the mechanical agriculture of later centuries. Every acre represents intimate knowledge passed down through bloodlines. Every crop decision the result of careful observation and hard-won wisdom. You know these fields as a modern person knows the rooms of their house. Not just their appearance, but their moods, their needs, their promises, and their threats. The work begins immediately, and with it comes the understanding that medieval labor was an entirely different creature than modern work. There are no measured breaks, no predetermined quitting times, no separation between the worker and the worked-upon land. The sun is your timekeeper, the weather your supervisor, the needs of growing things your only schedule. If it's plowing season, you'll walk behind oxen whose breath steams in the cool air, your hands wrapped around wooden handles worn smooth by generations of palms. The plow cuts through earth that might be yielding soft loam or stubborn clay, depending on the whims of weather and the character of this particular field. Each furrow requires attention. Too shallow and the seed will not take root. Too deep and you waste precious energy that cannot be replaced. The oxen themselves are partners in this enterprise, not merely tools. You know their individual temperaments as well as you know your own children. The way the lead ox favors his left front hoof, the tendency of the younger one to shy at unexpected sounds, the particular clicking sound you make with your tongue that means steady now in a language older than words. If it's sowing time, you carry a leather bag heavy with seed grain, each handful scattered with emotion that looks casual but represents years of learning. Too thick and the plants will compete and weaken each other. Too thin and you waste the potential of good earth. Your arm moves in arcs that have been calibrated by seasons of success and failure, each gesture a prayer cast in grain. The seed itself tells stories of survival and community. Some of it comes from your own portion of last year's harvest, carefully saved and protected through the lean months. Some might be borrowed from neighbors who had better fortune, creating debts that will be remembered and repaid when your own luck turns. And some, if the village has prospered, might come from the Lord's stores, distributed according to complex calculations of loyalty, need, and feudal obligation. But perhaps the most revealing work is the harvest, when the full weight of medieval interdependence becomes clear. The grain must be cut when it's ready, not when it's convenient, and the window of perfect ripeness is narrow and unforgiving. Too early and the grain is weak and worthless. Too late and weather or pests can destroy months of careful tending in a matter of days. The sickle in your hand is a tool of precision and desperation. Its curved blade, kept sharp through careful attention with whetstone and oil, must cut clean through stalks without shattering the precious grain heads. Your back bends to the work, and within hours you understand why medieval skeletons show the characteristic compression of spines shaped by a lifetime of this labor. Around you, the entire village moves in coordinated effort. Children follow behind the reapers, gathering dropped grain with an intensity that speaks to the value of every single kernel. Women bundle the cut stalks into sheaves, their movements economical and practiced. Even the elderly contribute what they can, their eyes scanning the field for missed stalks, their voices calling out warnings about changes in weather or the approach of travelers who might befriend or threat. The threshing that follows harvest is perhaps the most communal of all medieval activities. The grain must be separated from the stalks, and this requires the coordinated effort of multiple families. Flails rise and fall in rhythm, beating the grain from its husks in a percussion that can be heard across the village. The work is dusty, backbreaking, and absolutely essential. Without it, all the previous months of labor are meaningless. But even as you work, other concerns press against your consciousness. The bread eaten at dawn is already a memory, and the next meal is not guaranteed. Your stomach might gnaw with the particular emptiness that comes from hard physical labor fueled by insufficient food. This is not the dramatic starvation of famine stories, but the constant, grinding awareness that hunger hovers at the edges of even ordinary days. The meal that breaks the morning's work, if you're fortunate enough to have one, reveals the medieval relationship with food in all its complexity. Bread, if there is bread, is dark and dense, made from whatever grain could be ground. Barley bread for the prosperous, oat bread for the common folk, and in lean times, bread stretched with peas, beans, or even ground acorns. The taste is nothing like modern bread, coarser, more substantial, with the gritty texture of stone-ground grain and the slightly sour tang of natural fermentation. Ale accompanies most meals, not from preference but from necessity. Water, even from the village well, carries the constant threat of illness. Ale, with its low alcohol content and the purifying effect of the brewing process, provides both hydration and calories. The taste is flat and yeasty to modern palates, more like liquid bread than the refined beverages we know. But it's safe, and safety is a luxury beyond price. If you're particularly fortunate, there might be pottage, a thick stew that serves as the foundation of medieval nutrition. Into the pot goes whatever can be found. Vegetables from the garden, herbs for flavor and medicine, perhaps a bone with some meat clinging to it. The pottage cooks slowly throughout the day, growing richer and more complex as ingredients are added. It's eaten with wooden spoons or simply sopped up with bread, providing the calories necessary for the afternoon's labor. But food is never just about nutrition in this world. It's about status, community, and survival strategy. The miller's family might have white bread made from sifted flour, a luxury that sets them apart from their neighbors. The priest's table might include fish on Fridays and holy days, marking his position in the spiritual hierarchy. And your own meals, humble as they might be, still represent careful calculations of resource and need. As the sun reaches its zenith and begins its slow arc toward evening, the village takes on a different character. The urgent labor of morning gives way to the more varied activities that weave the social fabric of medieval life. This is when you begin to understand that survival in this world is not an individual endeavor but a collective enterprise, where every relationship carries the weight of mutual dependence. The well becomes a center of community life as women gather to draw water for afternoon cooking and evening washing. But the conversations that flow around the wellhead are far more than casual chatter. They're the nervous system of village life, carrying information that could mean the difference between prosperity and disaster. Word spreads of a merchant caravan spotted on the road, bringing with it the possibility of trade and the risk of bandits. News travels of illness in a neighboring village, information that will influence decisions about travel and trade for weeks to come. The women's voices rise and fall in patterns as old as human settlement, but their words carry practical weight. Warnings about a cow showing signs of murrain, advice about preserving food for winter, negotiations over the sharing of resources. Perhaps one family has surplus flax while another has excess wool, leading to arrangements that will benefit both households through the coming seasons. Children move through this adult world like water through a landscape, absorbing lessons in survival through observation and participation. A 5-year-old might be trusted with the crucial task of watching for wolves while the sheep graze, understanding that failure could mean the loss of animals essential to the family's survival. Older children learn by doing, girls spinning thread while listening to adult conversation, boys learning to repair tools while absorbing discussions about crop rotation and weather prediction. The village craftsmen emerge more fully into view during these afternoon hours. The blacksmith's hammer rings against anvil, shaping not just horseshoes and plowshares, but the tools upon which the entire community depends. Every nail, every knife blade, every iron fitting represents hours of skilled labor and precious resources. Iron itself must be carefully conserved, and broken tools are mended and remended until they can no longer hold their shape. The smith himself occupies a unique position in village hierarchy, essential but also slightly feared. His work requires him to control fire and transform metal, skills that edge toward the mysterious. His arms, blackened by soot and scarred by sparks, mark him as someone who works with forces that could destroy as easily as create. Children watch him with fascination and wariness, understanding instinctively that his knowledge is both necessary and dangerous. Near the smith's forge, other craftsmen ply their essential trades. The carpenter shapes wood with tools that would seem primitive by modern standards, but which, in skilled hands, can create everything from houses to church altars. His knowledge extends beyond mere construction. He understands which trees provide the strongest beams, how to season wood to prevent warping, how to join pieces so they'll withstand decades of stress and weather. The village women, meanwhile, engage in the constant production of textiles that keeps the community clothed and warm. Spinning wheels hum throughout the afternoon, turning raw wool or flax into thread. The sound is as constant as breathing, a background rhythm that speaks to the enormous labor required to create even the simplest cloth. Every piece of clothing the villagers wear represents months of work, from shearing sheep or harvesting flax, through the long process of cleaning, combing, spinning, weaving, cutting, and sewing. But perhaps most revealing of medieval life is the way even leisure time serves survival purposes. When work allows for rest, the activities that fill those moments are rarely purely recreational. Stories told around afternoon fires carry practical information, warnings about dangerous places, advice about dealing with officials, memories of previous famines or abundant harvests that inform current decisions. Music, when it occurs, often accompanies work rather than replacing it. Songs help coordinate group labor, their rhythms matching the swing of flails or the motion of communal tasks. The words themselves encode information, planting songs that help remember the proper sequence of agricultural tasks, historical ballads that preserve community memory, religious hymns that reinforce social order and moral expectations. The afternoon also brings occasional visitors, and these arrivals transform the village's rhythm entirely. A traveling merchant might spread his wares near the church, offering goods that the village cannot produce for itself: salt, iron goods, perhaps exotic spices for those who can afford them. His presence creates excitement and wariness in equal measure. Trade brings opportunity, but also the risk of cheating or theft. News from other places is welcome, but might carry information about political upheavals or approaching armies. Pilgrims passing through receive hospitality as both religious duty and practical investment. Today's pilgrim might be tomorrow's benefactor, and the obligation to provide food and shelter to religious travelers is taken seriously. But pilgrims also represent risk. They might carry disease, or their tales of miracles and distant shrines might unsettle the careful balance of local religious authority. Officials from the Lord's household arrive with the weight of feudal obligation behind them. The reeve who oversees agricultural work, the bailiff who collects taxes and settles disputes, the occasional knight or sergeant who represents military authority. All must be received with careful attention to rank and protocol. A wrong word or gesture of insufficient respect could have consequences that extend far beyond the immediate moment. As shadows lengthen and the sun begins its descent toward the western horizon, the medieval village takes on yet another character. This is the time when the day's labor must be reconciled with tomorrow's needs, when the constant calculations of survival become most apparent, and when the thin margin between sufficiency and want reveals itself in every decision. The evening meal, if circumstances allow for one, becomes a focal point around which the entire household revolves. But this is not the relaxed dining you might imagine. It's a careful orchestration of limited resources, where every portion must be weighed against need, store of supplies, and the uncertain promise of tomorrow's provisions. The fire that has been carefully tended throughout the day now serves its final crucial function. Cooking over an open flame requires skills that have been entirely lost to modern life. You must know how to bank coals to create even heat, how to position pots and pans to avoid scorching, how to judge doneness without thermometers or timers. The margin for error is narrow, burned food cannot be replaced, and insufficient cooking might mean illness or worse. The pottage that has simmered throughout the day reaches its fullest complexity by evening. Vegetables have broken down into a thick, nourishing base. If meat has been added, it has given up its essence to the communal pot. Herbs gathered from the kitchen garden or preserved from the previous growing season provide both flavor and medicinal benefit. This single vessel often contains the day's primary nutrition for the entire household. Bread, if flour has been available for baking, emerges from the communal oven or from Dutch ovens buried in the hearth's coals. The crust is thick and hard, providing protection for the softer interior that will be carefully portioned according to each family member's needs and status. The heel of the loaf might go to the head of household, while children receive smaller portions mixed with. As the morning light strengthens and the village settles into its daily rhythm, let us turn our attention to one man whose life illuminates the intricate web of survival, ambition, and fate that defined medieval existence. His name was Geoffrey, and he was a miller, a position that placed him at the fascinating intersection of necessity and suspicion in medieval society. Geoffrey was born in the year 1287, in the same village where we've been walking these morning paths. His birth coincided with a particularly harsh winter, one that would be remembered for decades as the year the mill will froze solid for 3 consecutive weeks. Perhaps this omen shaped his destiny, or perhaps it was simply the practical reality that his father, Thomas the miller, needed someone to inherit not just his trade, but his carefully negotiated position within the complex hierarchy of village life. To understand Geoffrey's world, you must first understand what it meant to be a miller in medieval England. The mill was not simply a business. It was a monopoly granted by the lord of the manor, a privilege that came with both substantial advantages and considerable risks. Every grain of wheat, barley, or rye grown on the lord's lands had to be ground at Geoffrey's mill, and for this service, he could claim a portion of every sack brought to him. This toll, called multure, was his primary source of income, but it was also a constant source of tension with his neighbors. Imagine Geoffrey as a young boy, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, learning the subtle arts that would define his life. His father's hands, rough and permanently dusted with flour, guide his small fingers along the surface of the millstones, teaching him to feel for the microscopic changes in texture that indicate when the stones need adjustment. The gap between the stones must be perfect, too wide, and the grain is crushed poorly, leaving the miller open to accusations of cheating. Too narrow, and the stones bind together, potentially cracking under the immense pressure of the turning wheel. The millstones themselves tell stories that young Jeffrey learns to read like sacred texts. These massive circular stones, each weighing several hundred pounds, were carved from specific types of rock chosen for their grinding properties. The runner stone, which rotates above the stationary bed stone, bears intricate patterns of grooves called furrows that channel the grain from the center outward as it's ground. Jeffrey learns that these furrows must be regularly recut with special tools, a process called dressing the stones that requires both physical strength and artistic precision. The water wheel itself becomes Jeffrey's constant companion, its steady rhythm marking out the hours of his childhood. He learns to read the stream like a manuscript, understanding how rainfall upstream affects the flow weeks later, how winter ice changes the wheel's efficiency, how summer drought might force him to ration his grinding time among increasingly desperate customers. The wheel turns not just grain into flour, but seasons into years, marking the passage of Jeffrey's life with its endless, hypnotic rotation. But Jeffrey's education extends far beyond the mechanical aspects of milling. His father teaches him the complex economics of the trade, how to calculate the proper toll for different types of grain, how to assess the quality of grain to determine fair payment, how to manage credit relationships with customers whose harvests come at different times. Young Jeffrey learns that being a miller means being part banker, part merchant, part diplomat, and always being watched for signs of dishonesty. The mill building itself becomes Jeffrey's classroom in survival. The massive wooden gears that transfer power from the water wheel to the grinding stones require constant maintenance. Jeffrey learns to identify the sound that indicates a gear tooth is beginning to crack, the vibration that suggests a bearing needs greasing, the subtle changes in the wheel's rhythm that warn of debris in the stream. Each sound has meaning, each vibration carries information crucial to keeping the mill operational. As Jeffrey grows into adolescence, his education broadens beyond the purely mechanical. His father begins teaching him the delicate art of customer relations in a world where the miller is both essential and mistrusted. Millers, you see, had a reputation for dishonesty that stretched back centuries and would persist for centuries more. The very nature of their work, taking grain from customers and returning flour, created countless opportunities for accusations of theft. A handful of grain here, a poorly adjusted stone there, and suddenly the miller is suspected of growing rich at his neighbor's expense. Jeffrey learns to perform his work with theatrical transparency. When customers bring their grain, he measures it carefully, often asking them to verify the measurement themselves. He adjusts his stones in full view, explaining each turn of the screw that controls the gap. He sweeps his workspace meticulously, ensuring that no stray grain can be accused of finding its way into his personal stores. These performances are not mere courtesy. They are survival strategies in a community where reputation could mean the difference between prosperity and ruin. The young man also learns the miller's most crucial skill, the ability to judge human nature as precisely as he judges grain quality. Mrs. Eleanor, the baker's wife, always suspects shortages and requires extra attention and reassurance. Her suspicions stem from a deep-seated fear of being cheated that reflects her own precarious position. As someone who depends on the quality of flour for her livelihood, she cannot afford to trust blindly. Jeffrey learns to address her concerns with patience and detailed explanations, understanding that her anxiety is rational given her circumstances. Young William, the shepherd's son, tends to exaggerate his losses, hoping to negotiate a lower toll. Jeffrey discovers that William's family has been struggling since a harsh winter killed many of their sheep, and his attempts at negotiation represent desperation rather than dishonesty. This understanding leads Jeffrey to develop flexible payment arrangements that acknowledge both his need for income and his customers' varying circumstances. The Reeves household expects special treatment befitting their status, while the poorest families require delicate handling of debts that might stretch through multiple seasons. Jeffrey learns that social hierarchy is not just about respect. It's about understanding the practical realities of who has power to help or harm his business. The Reeve can influence the Lord's opinion of the mill's operations, while poor families, though individually powerless, can collectively damage his reputation through gossip and complaint. During these formative years, Jeffrey also learns about the broader economic forces that affect his trade. Harvest failures in distant regions can drive up grain prices locally, creating both opportunities and dangers for the mill. Good harvests might mean more grain to grind, but also lower prices and reduced profit margins. Jeffrey begins to understand that his success depends not just on local conditions, but on weather patterns, trade routes, and political events that might occur hundreds of miles away. In 1307, when Jeffrey is 20 years old, his father dies suddenly of a fever that sweeps through the village that spring. The transition of the mill to Jeffrey's control is not automatic. It requires the Lord's approval, and the Lord expects payment for this privilege. Jeffrey must negotiate not only the continuation of his father's contract, but also the settlement of various debts and obligations that have accumulated over the years. The process takes months, during which the mill stands idle and the village grain goes unground, creating hardship that further complicates Jeffrey's position. The negotiations reveal the complex web of obligations that bind medieval society together. Jeffrey must pay a fee called a heriot to the Lord, typically his best animal or a sum of money, as recognition of his father's death. He must also pay a relief, another fee for the privilege of inheriting his father's position. These payments strain his resources at precisely the moment when the mill's inactivity has cut off his income. Worse, the idle mill creates cascading problems throughout the village. Farmers with grain to grind must travel to distant mills, incurring extra costs and time. The village baker struggles to maintain bread production, leading to shortages that affect everyone. Some villagers begin to blame Jeffrey for the delays, even though the legal process is beyond his control. These tensions teach Jeffrey harsh lessons about the interdependence of medieval economic life and the weight of responsibility that comes with providing essential services. Once established as the village miller, Jeffrey begins to understand the peculiar isolation of his position. He is neither peasant nor lord, neither poor nor truly wealthy. The mill provides him with steady income, but it also makes him a target for suspicion during times of scarcity. When harvests are poor, villagers eye his well-maintained appearance and wonder if he's been taking more than his fair share. When harvests are abundant, they question whether his toll is fair compensation for his services. This social isolation becomes particularly apparent during village celebrations and community gatherings. Jeffrey is welcome at these events. His presence is expected and his absence would be noted, but he often finds himself somewhat apart from the easy camaraderie of families who share similar circumstances. The farmer and the carpenter, the baker and the blacksmith, all face similar challenges and can commiserate over shared experiences. Jeffrey's challenges are unique to his position, creating a loneliness that wealth cannot entirely compensate. Jeffrey marries in 1310, choosing Agnes, the daughter of a prosperous farmer from a neighboring village. The marriage is as much a business arrangement as a romantic union. Agnes brings with her not only a dowry of silver coins and household goods, but also connections to suppliers of grain beyond the immediate area. Her family's prosperity provides Jeffrey with a buffer against local economic pressures and access to markets in the larger towns. The courtship process reveals much about medieval attitudes toward marriage and partnership. Geoffrey's interest in Agnes begins with practical considerations: her family status, her reputation for competence in household management, her potential contribution to the mill's operations. But as he gets to know her through carefully chaperoned meetings, he discovers qualities that make her attractive as a person as well as a partner. Agnes demonstrates intelligence in her questions about the mill's operations, showing that she understands the business she would be joining. She also displays the kind of diplomatic skills that Geoffrey recognizes as essential for managing the complex relationships that surround the mill. Agnes, for her part, sees in Geoffrey not just security but opportunity. Marriage to the miller offers her a chance to play a more active role in economic life than she might have as a farmer's wife. The mill's position at the center of village commerce appeals to her intelligence and ambition. She also recognizes that Geoffrey, despite his youth, has already begun to establish himself as a thoughtful and fair businessman, qualities that suggest their partnership might prosper. Their wedding, held in the village church on a crisp autumn morning in 1310, represents not just the joining of two individuals but the formal alliance of two families and their resources. The celebration that follows brings together nearly the entire village, partly from genuine good wishes but also from recognition that the miller's marriage affects everyone. A prosperous, stable mill household benefits the entire community, while discord or failure in the miller's family creates problems for everyone who depends on the mill's services. Their first child, a son they named Thomas after Geoffrey's father, is born in 1312, during a year of particular abundance. Geoffrey sees in his son's birth an opportunity to expand his influence beyond the mill itself. He begins lending money to neighbors facing temporary hardships, carefully calculating interest rates that will provide profit without appearing usurious. These loans, secured against future harvests or livestock, gradually create a web of obligation that extends Geoffrey's influence throughout the village. The lending business develops organically from Geoffrey's position as miller. Because he handles money regularly in his grain transactions, he accumulates silver coins more readily than most villagers. Because he understands agricultural cycles and local economic conditions, he can make informed decisions about creditworthiness. And because his mill provides steady income, he can afford to have money tied up in loans for extended periods. Geoffrey's approach to lending reflects both business acumen and social wisdom. He charges interest rates that are profitable but not exploitative, understanding that excessive rates would create resentment and potentially damage his primary business. He also structures loans to align with agricultural cycles, allowing borrowers to repay when their harvests provide them with income. This approach reduces defaults while building goodwill in the community. But Geoffrey's growing prosperity coincides with increasingly difficult times for England as a whole. The years between 1315 and 1322 bring a series of disasters that will test every survival strategy Geoffrey has learned. Unusually heavy rains ruin harvests across northern Europe, creating famine conditions that persist for years. The mill wheel, so dependent on controlled water flow, becomes difficult to manage as streams either flood violently or dry to mere trickles. The Great Famine, as historians would later call it, challenges Geoffrey in ways he never anticipated. The excessive rains that ruin crops also create problems for mill operations. Flooding carries debris that clogs the wheel and damages the machinery. Conversely, when the rains finally stop, streams drop to levels that barely turn the wheel, forcing Geoffrey to ration grinding time among increasingly desperate customers. During these famine years, Geoffrey faces moral dilemmas that would challenge any modern conscience. Desperate families offer him valuable possessions, heirloom jewelry, quality tools, even livestock, in exchange for flour? Does he accept these offers, knowing that he's profiting from desperation? Does he refuse them, knowing that his refusal might condemn families to starvation? Jeffrey chooses a middle path, accepting goods at fair value but extending credit terms that allow families to reclaim their possessions when conditions improve. These transactions require Jeffrey to become an expert appraiser of everything from silver brooches to draft horses. He must understand not just the intrinsic value of items, but also their sentimental worth to their owners and their practical utility in village life. A plow might be valuable as a tool, but if the family that owns it has no oxen to pull it, its immediate worth is limited. Jeffrey learns to see these desperate exchanges not just as business opportunities, but as community investments that might pay dividends in future loyalty and cooperation. The miller's reputation for hoarding grain makes him a particular target during these hungry years. Twice, groups of villagers approach the mill demanding to search his stores, convinced that he must be hiding surplus grain while others starve. Jeffrey submits to these searches with apparent grace, even inviting the searchers to examine every corner of his buildings. His transparency during these tense moments earns him grudging respect, but the fact that such searches occur at all reveals the constant suspicion under which he operates. These confrontations teach Jeffrey important lessons about crisis management and community psychology. He learns that in times of scarcity, rational discussion becomes impossible. People need to see evidence, not hear explanations. He also realizes that his relative prosperity, even during famine, makes him a natural target for blame and resentment. His response is to become even more transparent in his operations, inviting trusted villagers to witness his grain measurements and storage practices. The famine years also forced Jeffrey to make difficult decisions about his lending practices. As more families face desperate circumstances, demand for loans increases just as their ability to repay decreases. Jeffrey must balance compassion with prudence, understanding that excessive generosity might destroy his ability to help anyone. He develops a system of tiered lending, offering different terms based on family circumstances and likelihood of recovery. In 1320, Jeffrey's position becomes even more complex when the local lord dies and his heir, a young man with expensive habits and little understanding of rural economics, inherits the manor. The new lord immediately begins raising rents and fees, including the annual payment Jeffrey must make for the mill privilege. Simultaneously, he grants permission for a second mill to be built on a different stream, threatening Jeffrey's monopoly and his family's security. The arrival of the new lord represents the kind of unpredictable change that could devastate medieval livelihoods overnight. Jeffrey has spent years building relationships with the previous lord's officials, understanding their preferences and working within established routines. Suddenly, these relationships become worthless as new personalities with different priorities take control. The young lord's character becomes apparent through his early decisions. He shows little interest in the careful balance between extracting revenue and maintaining productive relationships that his father had cultivated. Instead, he sees the manor primarily as a source of income to fund his participation in court life and military adventures. This perspective puts him at odds with the practical realities of rural economics that Jeffrey understands intimately. Jeffrey's response to this crisis demonstrates the sophisticated political thinking that successful medieval people developed. Rather than directly opposing the new mill, he offers to form a partnership with its proposed operator, pooling their resources to create more efficient service for the area. When this proposal is rejected, Jeffrey shifts tactics, offering the new lord a loan to finance improvements to the manor house in exchange for a guarantee that no additional mills will be licensed for 10 years. The negotiation process stretches over months, conducted through intermediaries and requiring Jeffrey to navigate the complex etiquette of dealing with social superiors. He must show appropriate deference while also protecting his interests, demonstrate loyalty while also asserting his rights. The final agreement he reaches is a masterpiece of medieval compromise. He pays increased fees but receives expanded territorial rights, and he provides the Lord with regular loans at favorable interest rates in exchange for protection against future competition. These negotiations teach Jeffrey valuable lessons about the nature of feudal power. He learns that lords, despite their apparent authority, are often constrained by their own financial needs and political obligations. A lord who ruins his tenants' prosperity ultimately ruins his own income. This understanding allows Jeffrey to position his proposals not as challenges to lordly authority but as solutions to mutual problems. Jeffrey's domestic life during these years provides insight into how medieval families balanced personal relationships with economic necessities. Agnes proves to be not merely a wife but a business partner, managing the mill's accounts with a precision that would impress modern accountants. She also serves as Jeffrey's primary intelligence gatherer, maintaining relationships with women throughout the village that provide early warning of potential problems or opportunities. Agnes's role in the mill's operations extends far beyond traditional women's work. She handles much of the financial record-keeping, maintaining detailed accounts of grain received, flour dispensed, and payments collected. Her mathematical skills, unusual for women of her era, prove invaluable in managing the complex credit relationships that increasingly define the mill's business. She also negotiates with female customers, understanding their concerns and constraints in ways that Jeffrey sometimes cannot. The partnership between Jeffrey and Agnes reflects the practical realities of medieval marriage among the merchant classes. Romantic love, while not unknown, is less important than mutual competence and complementary skills. Their relationship deepens over time as they learn to work together effectively, but it's built on a foundation of shared economic interests and mutual respect for each other's abilities. Their children, Thomas is eventually joined by 2 daughters, Mary and Catherine, and another son, William, grow up understanding that they are both privileged and vulnerable. They have better food and clothing than many of their playmates, but they also face suspicion and occasional hostility because of their father's profession. Jeffrey carefully manages their education, ensuring that they can read and calculate sufficiently to manage business affairs, but not so obviously that they appear to be reaching above their station. The education Jeffrey provides his children reflects his understanding of their precarious social position. Too little education, and they won't be able to manage the complex business they might inherit. Too much, and they risk appearing to claim status above their birth. Jeffrey teaches them to read and write, essential skills for managing accounts and contracts, but he's careful to present this education as practical training rather than scholarly pretension. Thomas, as the eldest son, receives the most intensive training in mill operations. By his teens, he can dress millstones, adjust water flow, and handle most customer interactions. But Jeffrey also ensures that Thomas understands the broader context of their business, the political relationships that protect their monopoly, the economic forces that affect grain prices, the social dynamics that can make or break a miller's reputation. The daughters, Mary and Catherine, receive education that reflects their likely roles as wives of prosperous craftsmen or merchants. They learn household management, including the complex skills of food preservation, textile production, and financial management. But they also learn enough about the mill's operations to serve as backup managers if circumstances require it. As Jeffrey enters his 40s, he begins to diversify his interests beyond the mill itself. He purchases a small flock of sheep, reasoning that wool production will provide income independent of grain harvests. He also begins trading in preserved fish, using his connections with traveling merchants to buy salt cod in bulk and sell it locally at significant profit. These ventures require him to travel occasionally to larger towns, exposing him to ideas and opportunities beyond the narrow confines of village life. The sheep venture represents Jeffrey's first major investment outside his core business. Sheep require different knowledge and skills than mill operations, forcing Jeffrey to learn about animal husbandry, pasture management, and wool markets. He starts small, purchasing just a dozen ewes and a ram, gradually building his flock as he gains experience and confidence. The wool trade proves more complex than Jeffrey initially expected. Quality varies significantly based on breed, diet, and care, and Jeffrey must learn to assess these factors to get fair prices for his product. He also discovers that wool markets are subject to fluctuations based on factors far beyond local control. Political relationships with Flanders, where much English wool is processed, can dramatically affect prices. Jeffrey's fish trading develops from his observation that preserved fish commands high prices in his inland village, especially during Lent when religious law requires Christians to avoid meat. He begins by purchasing small quantities from merchants passing through, but gradually develops relationships with suppliers in coastal towns. This trade requires him to understand preservation techniques, transportation logistics, and seasonal demand patterns. These diversification efforts teach Jeffrey important lessons about risk management and market dynamics. He learns that spreading investments across different sectors provides protection against sector-specific disasters. A bad grain harvest might hurt the mill's business, but it won't affect wool or fish prices. Similarly, changes in religious practices that reduce fish consumption won't affect grain grinding or wool production. The need to travel for these expanded business interests exposes Jeffrey to ideas and practices from other regions. He observes different mill designs, marketing strategies, and business relationships that he can adapt to his own circumstances. These travels also expand his network of contacts, creating opportunities for future business development. The 1330s bring new challenges as political instability affects even remote villages. The beginning of what will later be called the 100 Years' War creates demands for taxes and military service that strain rural communities. Jeffrey finds himself appointed to help collect tax assessments, a role that further complicates his relationships with neighbors. He must balance loyalty to royal authority with consideration for people he's known since childhood, many of whom are genuinely unable to pay the sums demanded. Jeffrey's appointment as a tax collector reflects both his financial competence and his established position in the community. Royal officials need local people who understand village economics and can make informed judgments about families' actual ability to pay. Jeffrey's knowledge of who has borrowed money, who has hidden resources, and who is genuinely destitute makes him valuable for this purpose. The role creates intense personal conflicts for Jeffrey. As a tax collector, he must enforce royal demands that he knows will cause hardship for his neighbors. As a community member, he wants to protect families from excessive burdens. His solution is to fulfill his legal obligations while using his position to advocate for reasonable assessments and payment terms. Jeffrey's approach to this dilemma reveals the pragmatic flexibility that characterizes successful medieval people. He fulfills his obligations to collect taxes, but he also provides information to the royal tax collectors about which families genuinely cannot pay and which might be hiding resources. His detailed knowledge of village economics makes him valuable to the authorities, while his discretion and fairness in reporting helps maintain his standing in the community. The tax collection process also provides Jeffrey with insights into the broader political and economic forces affecting the kingdom. He learns about the costs of maintaining armies, the logistics of medieval warfare, and the complex relationships between local communities and royal authority. This knowledge helps him make better business decisions and anticipate future developments that might affect his enterprises. In 1338, Geoffrey faces a personal crisis when his eldest son Thomas, now 26 and married with children of his own, begins questioning the family's business practices. Thomas has been influenced by reformist religious ideas that emphasize spiritual poverty and condemn excessive profit-taking. He argues that the family should reduce the mill toll and forgive outstanding debts, prioritizing Christian charity over financial gain. Thomas's religious awakening reflects broader spiritual movements of the 14th century that challenged traditional relationships between commerce and Christianity. Influenced by Franciscan ideals of poverty and emerging mystical traditions that emphasized personal relationship with God, Thomas begins to see his family's prosperity as potentially sinful. The conflict between Geoffrey and his son illuminates the generational tensions that accompanied changing religious and social attitudes in the 14th century. Geoffrey sees his business practices as necessary for family survival and security. Thomas views them as potentially sinful accumulations of wealth at others' expense. Their debate, conducted over months of tense family meals, touches on fundamental questions about the relationship between faith and commerce that were reshaping medieval society. Geoffrey finds himself defending not just his business practices but his entire worldview. He argues that the mill provides essential services, that fair profits are necessary to maintain operations, and that the family's prosperity benefits the entire community through employment, loans, and charitable giving. Thomas counters that excessive profit-taking exploits the poor and that true Christian living requires voluntary poverty and service to others. The theological dimensions of their argument reflect sophisticated understanding of Christian doctrine on both sides. Geoffrey cites biblical passages that support honest labor and fair trade, while Thomas quotes Jesus' teachings about the difficulty of the rich entering heaven. Their debate reveals how medieval people engaged seriously with religious questions and their practical implications. Geoffrey's resolution of this conflict demonstrates the wisdom he's accumulated through decades of navigating complex social relationships. Rather than simply asserting paternal authority, he proposes a compromise that acknowledges Thomas's concerns while protecting the family's interests. They establish a fund for charitable giving, providing regular assistance to the poorest village families. They also create more flexible payment terms for the mill toll, allowing customers to work off debts through labor rather than always demanding cash payment. The final years of Geoffrey's life, from 1339 to his death in 1341, are marked by the increasing presence of what contemporaries called the Great Mortality, the beginning of the plague pandemic that would reshape. As Geoffrey's mill will fades into the silence of centuries, we turn our attention to one of the most profound mysteries of medieval life. A mystery hidden not in buried treasure or ancient ruins, but in the very structure of the medieval mind itself. It is the mystery of memory. How people in an age before books were common, before writing was widespread, before any external device could store information, managed to preserve and transmit the vast complexity of human knowledge. Picture, if you will, a world where the contents of an entire library exist only in the minds of living people, where legal codes, medical knowledge, historical chronicles, religious teachings, technical procedures, genealogies, astronomical calculations, and the accumulated wisdom of generations are preserved not on paper or parchment, but in the intricate, living architecture of human memory. This is not the simple memorization you might remember from school, the rote learning of multiplication tables or historical dates. Medieval memory was an art form, a technology, a complete system for organizing and retrieving information that modern minds, dependent on external storage, can barely comprehend. It was, in many ways, the defining skill that separated the educated from the illiterate, the powerful from the powerless, the wise from the merely intelligent. The roots of this memory culture stretch back to the classical world, but medieval scholars and craftsmen developed it into something uniquely their own. They called it the art of memory, ars memoriae, and it was considered as essential to education as reading or writing. Perhaps more essential, since even those who could read had access to very few books, and those books were precious beyond modern understanding. Imagine yourself as a young student in a medieval monastery school, perhaps in the year 1200. You are learning not just to read Latin, but to construct what medieval scholars called a memory palace, an elaborate mental architecture where information could be stored, organized, and retrieved with remarkable precision. Your teacher, Brother Benedict, guides you through the process with a patience born of understanding that your success depends not on your ability to look things up, but on your ability to carry knowledge with you wherever you go. The technique begins with a building you know intimately. Your childhood home, perhaps, or the monastery chapel where you attend daily prayers. In your mind, you walk through this familiar space, but now each room, each corner, each architectural detail becomes a storage location for specific information. The heavy wooden door becomes the repository for everything you need to know about the Church Fathers. The stone altar holds the mysteries of the Eucharist. The carved wooden screen contains the genealogies of biblical kings. But the medieval memory palace was far more sophisticated than simple spatial association. Each piece of information was transformed into a vivid, often bizarre image designed to stick in the mind with extraordinary tenacity. Abstract concepts became concrete pictures. Complex theological arguments were transformed into dramatic scenes populated by familiar figures engaged in memorable actions. Consider how a medieval student might memorize the 7 deadly sins. Pride becomes a magnificent peacock preening before a mirror. Envy transforms into a pale, thin woman gnawing her own fingers while staring at her neighbor's garden. Wrath appears as a red-faced warrior tearing his own clothing in fury. Each image is placed in a specific location within the memory palace, creating a mental journey that can be traveled again and again to retrieve the information intact. The monastery libraries of medieval Europe, those repositories of ancient knowledge that modern scholars prize so highly, were in many ways less important than the living libraries that walked the corridors in the form of learned monks. Brother Augustine, the monastery's historian, carries in his memory not just the dates of important events, but entire chronicles complete with vivid descriptions of battles, political intrigue, and natural disasters. When he speaks of the Great Famine of 1124, he doesn't consult a book. He walks through the rooms of his memory palace where that information is stored, retrieving not just facts but carefully preserved emotional resonances that make the past come alive. The practical applications of this memory culture extended far beyond the monastery walls. Medieval craftsmen, who served apprenticeships lasting 7 years or more, absorbed not just the manual skills of their trades, but vast bodies of technical knowledge that had to be memorized precisely. The master mason who directs the construction of a cathedral carries in his memory the mathematical relationships that ensure structural stability, the symbolic meanings that govern architectural proportions, the practical procedures that transform raw stone into soaring walls and delicate tracery. Watch him as he walks the construction site, his weathered hands tracing measurements in the air, his eyes calculating angles and stresses with a precision that would impress modern engineers. He has no blueprints in the modern sense, no reference manuals to consult. The cathedral exists first in his memory, as complete and detailed as the stone structure that will eventually rise from the foundation. Every arch, every buttress, every carved detail has been carefully placed in the architectural spaces of his mind, ready to be retrieved and translated into physical reality. The legal system of medieval Europe operated on similar principles. Judges and lawyers, many of whom could read but had limited access to written legal codes, carried the law in their memories. They could recite complex legal precedents, recall the specific language of charters and agreements, and apply intricate legal principles to novel situations, all without consulting external sources. The most remarkable example of this legal memory culture was the figure of the living charter, a person, usually elderly and respected, who had witnessed important legal transactions and could testify to their details decades later. These human repositories of legal knowledge were consulted in disputes, called upon to verify boundaries, and trusted to preserve the rights and obligations that governed community life. Medieval physicians, operating without medical textbooks or reference works, carried in their memories vast pharmacopoeias of herbal remedies, detailed anatomical knowledge, and complex diagnostic procedures. The master physician could recall not just which herbs treated which ailments, but the precise methods of preparation, the proper dosages, the seasonal variations in potency, and the subtle signs that indicated when one treatment should be abandoned in favor of another. But perhaps the most extraordinary example of medieval memory culture was the tradition of oral poetry and storytelling. The great epic poems of medieval Europe, the Chanson de Roland, the Nibelungenlied, the tales of Arthur and his knights, existed for centuries in the memories of professional storytellers before they were ever written down. These poets, traveling from court to court, carried in their minds not just the basic stories but thousands of lines of verse, complete with complex rhyme schemes, metrical patterns, and elaborate descriptive passages. The Irish bardic tradition, which preserved historical and genealogical information in verse form, represents perhaps the most sophisticated development of memorial culture. Irish bards underwent training that lasted 20 years, during which they memorized not just poetry but the entire history of their people. A master bard could recite the genealogy of any noble family back dozens of generations, tell the story of every significant battle, and preserve the legal traditions that governed Irish society. Archaeological evidence suggests that this memory culture was supported by physical practices that enhanced memorial capacity. Medieval manuscripts often contain elaborate visual mnemonics, decorative elements that served not just as ornamentation but as memory aids. The intricate illuminations that adorn medieval books were designed to create vivid mental images that would help readers remember textual content. Excavations of medieval schools and monasteries have revealed physical spaces apparently designed to support memory training. Cloisters with their repetitive architectural elements, chapter houses with their carefully arranged seating, even the layout of monastery gardens seem to reflect an understanding of how physical environment could enhance mental organization. The mystery deepens when we consider the psychological implications of this memory culture. Modern research in cognitive science suggests that the medieval approach to memory was not just different from ours. It may have been neurologically superior in many ways. The medieval mind, trained from childhood to store and organize vast amounts of information internally, developed cognitive structures that modern minds, dependent on external storage, no longer possess. Medieval people appear to have experienced memory not as a passive repository of information, but as an active, creative faculty that could combine and recombine stored elements in novel ways. The medieval scholar who had memorized dozens of texts could mentally cross-reference them, finding connections and contradictions that would escape someone simply reading the text sequentially. The medieval craftsman who carried technical knowledge in memory could adapt and modify procedures in ways that would be difficult for someone following written instructions. This memorial culture also created forms of collective memory that have largely disappeared from modern life. Medieval communities preserved their histories not in written records but in the shared memories of their members. The story of the village's founding, the boundaries of common lands, the obligations owed to various lords, All of this information existed in the collective memory of the community, reinforced through regular repetition and passed down through generations. The gradual decline of this memory culture, beginning in the later Middle Ages as books became more common and literacy more widespread, represents one of the most profound cognitive shifts in human history. As external storage devices, first books, then computers, now digital databases, took over the functions once performed by trained memory, the human mind was freed to pursue other forms of processing. But something was also lost: the intimate, embodied relationship between knowledge and knower that characterized medieval learning. The mystery of medieval memory extends beyond individual psychology to encompass entire systems of knowledge transmission. How did medieval craftsmen preserve and improve upon technical procedures across generations without written manuals? How did medieval farmers maintain and develop agricultural techniques that sustained complex societies for centuries? How did medieval communities maintain their social structures and cultural traditions across periods of political upheaval and social change? Recent archaeological work has begun to reveal the physical traces of this memory culture. Excavations at medieval craft workshops show evidence of teaching practices that relied heavily on demonstration and repetition rather than written instruction. The arrangement of tools, the organization of workspace, even the wear patterns on medieval artifacts suggest methods of knowledge transmission that bypassed written documentation entirely. The mystery is compounded by the realization that medieval people may have possessed cognitive abilities that modern people have lost. The capacity for precise verbal memory, the ability to maintain complex mental organizational systems, the skill of combining and recombining stored information in creative ways. These medieval mental achievements seem almost superhuman to modern minds accustomed to external storage and rapid information retrieval. As we contemplate this lost world of living memory, we begin to understand one of the most fundamental differences between medieval and modern consciousness. Medieval people lived in a world where knowledge was literally embodied, where wisdom was inseparable from the person who possessed it, where the death of a master craftsman or learned scholar represented not just personal loss, but the potential disappearance of irreplaceable knowledge. This understanding casts new light on medieval attitudes toward education, authority, and social hierarchy. In a world where knowledge existed primarily in human memory, the person who possessed rare or valuable information held a form of power that could not be easily transferred or replicated. The medieval master, whether in scholarship or craft, was not just someone who knew things. He was someone who was the embodiment of living knowledge. The mystery of medieval memory also illuminates the profound vulnerability of medieval culture. When plague, war, or other disasters struck medieval communities, they lost not just lives but living libraries of knowledge and skill. The disruption of normal patterns of apprenticeship and education could result in the permanent loss of techniques, traditions, and cultural practices that had been carefully maintained for generations. Archaeological evidence from plague-devastated communities reveals the tragic consequences of this vulnerability. Craft traditions that had flourished for centuries disappeared within a single generation when the artisans who embodied them died before they could pass their knowledge to apprentices. Agricultural techniques that had sustained communities for generations were lost when experienced farmers died before they could teach their methods to their children. Yet the mystery of medieval memory also reveals the remarkable resilience of human cognitive adaptation. Medieval people, faced with the challenge of preserving complex knowledge without adequate external storage, developed mental capabilities that allowed them to maintain sophisticated civilizations across centuries of political upheaval and social change. They created systems of knowledge transmission that were flexible enough to adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining essential continuities across generations. The rediscovery of medieval memory techniques by modern scholars has led to a new appreciation of the cognitive possibilities that were lost during the transition to print culture. Educators and psychologists are beginning to explore how medieval memory methods might be adapted to enhance modern learning, how the principles of the memory palace might be applied to contemporary educational challenges. But perhaps the most profound mystery of medieval memory lies not in its techniques or applications, but in its implications for understanding human consciousness itself. The medieval mind, trained from childhood to organize and store information internally, may have experienced consciousness in ways that are fundamentally different from modern mental life. The medieval person's sense of self, of identity, of relationship to knowledge and community was shaped by cognitive structures that modern people can barely imagine. As we drift deeper into contemplation of this lost world of living memory, let the mystery settle around you like evening mist. Feel the weight of knowledge that cannot be lost because it lives within you. Sense the connections between mind and information that make each person a unique repository of wisdom. Listen to the whispered conversations between past and present, between the quick intelligence of the moment and the deep, slow wisdom of accumulated memory. In the quiet spaces between thoughts, in the gentle rhythm of breath and heartbeat, the mystery of medieval memory continues to unfold. It reminds us that the human mind, properly trained and carefully tended, can hold wonders that no external device can match. It suggests that the relationship between knowledge and knower, between wisdom and the wise, is more intimate and more profound than our modern world often recognizes. The mystery endures, patient and persistent, waiting for those who would seek to understand not just what medieval people knew, but how they knew it, and what it meant to live in a world where knowledge was not something you had, but something you were. As the mysteries of medieval memory fade into the quiet corners of consciousness, we turn our attention to a world that existed in sharp contrast to the village life we explored earlier. Here, in the great halls and private chambers of the medieval nobility, we find a different kind of survival challenge, one measured not in securing adequate food or shelter, but in navigating the treacherous currents of power, prestige, and political intrigue. Let us enter the household of Eleanor de Montfort, Countess of Leicester, in the year 1265. Eleanor was a woman of extraordinary position and influence, sister to King Henry III of England, widow of the famous Simon de Montfort, and mother to children whose futures would be shaped by the violent political upheavals of 13th century England. Her court provides us with a window into the daily realities of medieval aristocratic life, realities that would challenge modern assumptions about luxury, privacy, and individual autonomy. The great hall of Eleanor's residence at Kenilworth Castle awakens before dawn, not to the simple tolling of a village church bell, but to the complex choreography of a household that must serve simultaneously as military headquarters, administrative center, diplomatic venue, and family home. The sounds that mark the beginning of an aristocratic day are layered and intricate. The soft footsteps of servants lighting braziers throughout the hall, the whispered conversations of household officials planning the day's activities, the distant sound of horses being prepared in the courtyard, and the gentle rustling of rich fabrics as noble family members and their attendants begin their elaborate morning preparations. Eleanor herself rises in a chamber that would seem both luxurious and austere to modern eyes. The walls are covered with tapestries that serve both decorative and practical purposes. Their rich colors and intricate scenes display the family's wealth and taste, while their thick weave provides insulation against the stone wall's winter chill. The floor is covered with rushes, like those in the village homes we visited earlier, but these rushes are changed daily and are often mixed with sweet-smelling herbs and flowers that release their fragrance as they are walked upon. The Countess's morning routine reveals the complex layers of meaning embedded in even the most mundane aristocratic activities. Her clothing, far from being simply functional, serves as a sophisticated form of communication about her status, her family's political allegiances, and her personal wealth. Each garment is carefully chosen not just for comfort or attractiveness, but for the messages it sends to the various audiences who will observe her throughout the day. Her chemise, the linen undergarment that lies closest to her skin, is made from fabric so fine that its production required the work of dozens of skilled craftsmen. The linen itself comes from Flanders, where the climate and soil conditions produce flax of exceptional quality. The spinning and weaving of this linen was performed by artisans whose skills were carefully guarded secrets, passed down through generations of guild members. The final garment, though invisible to observers, represents a level of luxury that would have been unimaginable to the village families we encountered earlier. Over this foundation, Eleanor's servants help her into a gown that serves as both garment and political statement. The fabric is silk, imported at great expense from the Mediterranean, dyed with colors that require rare and costly materials. The deep blue of the gown comes from ultramarine, ground from lapis lazuli stones transported across continents. The golden threads that form intricate patterns throughout the fabric are made from actual gold wire, beaten thin and wrapped around silk cores by specialized craftsmen. But perhaps most revealing is the process by which Eleanor is dressed. This is not a private, individual activity, but a social ritual that involves multiple participants and serves multiple purposes. Her personal maid, a young woman named Marguerite who has served the family for years, handles the intimate tasks of helping with undergarments and basic positioning. But the placement of each outer garment is overseen by Eleanor's chamberlain, a male household official who understands the political implications of every detail of her appearance. The arrangement of Eleanor's headdress, for instance, follows not just fashion but protocol. The way her hair is covered and displayed indicates her marital status, her rank within the nobility, and her family's current political position. During periods when her family is in the king's favor, she might wear her headdress in a style that emphasizes her royal connections. During more difficult times, she might choose arrangements that suggest humility and submission to higher authority. As Eleanor prepares for the day, the great hall below fills with the complex society that surrounds every medieval noble household. Knights and their squires, who owe military service to the family, gather to discuss training schedules, equipment maintenance, and the various military obligations that might be called upon at any time. These men are not simply warriors but administrators, diplomats, and estate managers who must balance their martial duties with the complex business of running a medieval domain. The household chaplain, a learned priest who serves not just the family's spiritual needs but also as secretary, translator, and diplomatic correspondent, prepares for the day's religious observances. The chapel services that punctuate the aristocratic day are elaborate affairs that serve multiple purposes. They fulfill religious obligations, display the family's piety and prosperity, and provide formal occasions for the conduct of business that requires witness and ceremony. Eleanor's steward, the man responsible for managing the vast economic enterprises that support the household, reviews accounts and correspondence that reveal the complexity of medieval aristocratic finance. The family's income comes from dozens of sources: rents from agricultural estates, fees from markets and mills, payments from tenants and vassals, profits from trade enterprises, and the complicated financial arrangements that govern relationships with other noble families. The breakfast served in Eleanor's private chamber illustrates both the luxury and the limitations of medieval aristocratic life. The food itself is elaborate by village standards: white bread made from carefully sifted flour, meat from animals raised specifically for the Lord's table, spices imported from distant lands, and wine from the family's own vineyards. But the meal is also constrained by the realities of medieval food preservation and transportation. Much of the meat is heavily salted or smoked. The bread must be consumed quickly before it spoils, and even the finest wine carries the taste of the wooden casks in which it was stored. The social dynamics of this aristocratic breakfast reveal the complex web of relationships that governed noble households. Eleanor eats not alone but in the company of several female companions, noble ladies who serve simultaneously as friends, advisors, and hostages for their family's political loyalty. Their conversation, while appearing casual, is actually a sophisticated form of diplomatic negotiation, as each woman represents not just her own interests but those of her family and their various political alliances. The young pages who serve the meal are themselves noble children, sent to Eleanor's household not as servants but as students in the complex arts of aristocratic behavior. They learn not just the practical skills of household management but the subtle social codes that govern interaction between different ranks of nobility. Their mistakes are corrected not harshly but with the understanding that their education in these matters will determine their future success in aristocratic society. As the morning progresses, Eleanor's household becomes a stage for the performance of political and social relationships that extend far beyond the castle walls. Messengers arrive with correspondence from other noble families, from royal officials, from bishops and abbots whose spiritual authority intersects with temporal power. Each message must be carefully evaluated not just for its explicit content but for its implications regarding the sender's current political position and future intentions. The process of responding to this correspondence reveals the collaborative nature of medieval noble decision-making. Eleanor does not simply dictate responses but engages in lengthy consultations with her various advisors. The chaplain provides expertise on religious and legal matters. The steward offers insights into the financial implications of various courses of action. The senior knights contribute their understanding of military and political realities. The final decisions are Eleanor's, but they emerge from a complex process of consultation and consensus building that would be familiar to modern corporate executives. The afternoon brings a different set of challenges as Eleanor holds court in the Great Hall. This is not a legal proceeding in the modern sense, but a complex social ritual that serves multiple functions. Tenants and vassals present their grievances and requests, but they also participate in a ceremonial reaffirmation of the relationships that bind the medieval social order together. Eleanor's responses to these presentations are carefully calculated to maintain her authority while also demonstrating her fairness and wisdom. The cases presented to Eleanor during these court sessions reveal the intricate nature of medieval social relationships. A dispute between two tenant farmers over water rights becomes an opportunity to reaffirm the principles that govern resource allocation. A request from a village for permission to hold a market becomes a negotiation over the balance between local economic development and the family's traditional privileges. A complaint about a knight's behavior toward village women becomes a delicate matter of maintaining military loyalty while also protecting the family's reputation for justice. Eleanor's handling of these matters demonstrates the sophisticated political skills required for medieval noble survival. She must appear decisive while also consulting with her advisors. She must seem generous while also protecting her family's resources. She must maintain her authority while also appearing accessible to those who depend on her protection. Every decision sets precedents that will influence future cases, and every precedent must be consistent with the complex web of laws, customs, and relationships that govern medieval society. The evening meal in Eleanor's household provides perhaps the most revealing glimpse into the realities of medieval aristocratic life. The Great Hall fills with a carefully orchestrated social performance that serves multiple purposes simultaneously. The seating arrangements reflect and reinforce the complex hierarchies that govern the household. The service of food follows elaborate protocols that demonstrate the family's wealth and sophistication. The entertainment provides opportunities for the display of cultural knowledge and artistic patronage. But beneath this surface of luxury and ceremony, the evening meal also reveals the constraints and vulnerabilities that shaped medieval aristocratic life. The food, while elaborate, is also seasonal and dependent on the success of agricultural production. The social gathering, while festive, is also carefully monitored for signs of political discontent or shifting loyalties. The entertainment, while beautiful, is also a form of political communication, as songs and stories carry messages about the family's achievements and aspirations. Eleanor's retirement to her private chambers at the end of the day provides a moment of relative privacy. But even this privacy is constrained by the realities of medieval household life. Her personal servants remain nearby, ready to respond to any need that might arise during the night. The guards who protect the castle maintain their vigilance, aware that political enemies might strike at any moment. The fires that provide warmth must be carefully tended to prevent the dual dangers of cold and conflagration. As Eleanor prepares for sleep, attended by her personal maid and surrounded by the familiar luxury of her chamber, she participates in evening prayers that serve both spiritual and practical purposes. The religious observances provide comfort and hope in a world of constant uncertainty, but they also serve as a form of insurance, maintaining the family's reputation for piety that helps protect their political position. The contrast between Eleanor's world and the village life we explored earlier illuminates the profound inequalities that characterized medieval society. While village families struggled to secure adequate food and shelter, Eleanor's household enjoyed luxury that would have seemed almost magical to ordinary people. But this luxury came with its own forms of constraint and vulnerability. Eleanor's life was as carefully regulated as that of any village peasant, though the regulations that governed her were social and political rather than economic. The medieval aristocrat lived in a world of constant performance, where every action was observed and interpreted by audiences who might be allies, enemies, or both. The luxury that surrounded Eleanor was not simply personal comfort, but a necessary tool for maintaining the political relationships that preserved her family's position. The elaborate ceremonies that punctuated her day were not merely social pleasures, but essential rituals that reinforced the hierarchies upon which medieval society depended. Eleanor's story also reveals the particular vulnerabilities that faced medieval noble women. Despite her high rank and considerable personal wealth, her political position depended ultimately on relationships with male relatives and allies. Her widow's status provided her with certain freedoms, but it also exposed her to pressures to remarry in ways that might serve others' political interests rather than her own. Her children's futures depended not just on their own abilities, but on the shifting political fortunes that could elevate or destroy noble families within a single generation. The complexity of Eleanor's daily life illustrates why medieval aristocratic society required individuals of extraordinary intelligence, energy, and social skill. Success in this world demanded not just the obvious qualities of leadership and decision-making, but also the subtler arts of diplomatic negotiation, cultural patronage, and social performance. A medieval noble who failed to master these skills might find their family's fortunes declining rapidly, regardless of their military prowess or economic resources. As we reflect upon Eleanor's world, we begin to understand that medieval aristocratic life, despite its apparent luxury, was in many ways as demanding and constrained as the village life we explored earlier. The challenges were different: political rather than economic, social rather than material, but they were no less real or pressing. The medieval noble, like the medieval peasant, lived in a world where survival required constant attention to complex relationships and changing circumstances. The evening shadows lengthen across the great hall of Kenilworth Castle, and the day's complex choreography of power and prestige draws to its close. Eleanor's household settles into the quiet routines of night, but the political currents that shape their world continue to flow, carrying with them the hopes and fears of all who depend on the fragile stability of medieval aristocratic society. In the contrast between Eleanor's silk-draped chamber and the rush-scattered floors of village homes, we see reflected the full spectrum of medieval life. From the mill wheel's steady rhythm to the complex negotiations of the Great Hall, from the memory palaces of learned monks to the political calculations of noble ladies, the medieval world reveals itself as a place of extraordinary diversity and complexity, where survival, whether material or political, required skills and knowledge that modern people can barely imagine. As our journey through medieval time draws to its close, let us rest for a moment in the quiet space between then and now, feeling the gentle weight of centuries that separate us from the world we have been exploring. The village dawn grows dim in memory. Geoffrey's mill will slows to stillness. The mysteries of medieval memory fade into whisper, and Eleanor's great hall settles into the peaceful silence of the long ago. You have walked briefly in the footsteps of people whose daily lives were shaped by challenges that would test every assumption you hold about comfort, safety, and survival. You have felt the constant presence of cold and dampness, tasted the smoke-tinged air of a world without electric light, and sensed the complex social rhythms that governed every interaction from sunrise to sunset. Perhaps most importantly, you have glimpsed the extraordinary resilience and adaptability that allowed medieval people not just to survive but to create a civilization of remarkable complexity and beauty. In their patient accumulation of knowledge, their careful cultivation of relationships, their quiet mastery of skills that have been lost to modern life. They demonstrate that human beings can adapt to almost any circumstances, finding ways to thrive even in conditions that would challenge us profoundly. The medieval world, for all its hardships and constraints, was also a world of profound community, where individual survival was inseparable from collective well-being. It was a world where knowledge was treasured because it was embodied, where relationships were cultivated because they were essential, where daily life was shaped by rhythms that connected human existence to the larger patterns of seasons and stars. As you settle deeper into the comfort of your modern surroundings, feeling the gentle warmth that surrounds you, breathing air that carries no smoke or chill, let gratitude for the present moment mingle with respect for those who came before. The medieval world that seemed so foreign and challenging was, after all, the world that created the foundations upon which our own lives rest. The innovations in agriculture that feed us, the legal traditions that protect us, the architectural principles that shelter us, the artistic traditions that inspire us. All of these trace their origins back through the centuries to the patient work of medieval farmers and craftsmen, scholars and artists, who built their world with the same care and determination that we bring to building ours. In the gentle distance of centuries, the struggles and triumphs of medieval life become a source not of anxiety but of wonder. The village that seemed so challenging at dawn now appears as a community of remarkable cooperation and mutual support. Geoffrey's mill, which seemed so precarious, now stands as a monument to human ingenuity and persistence. The mysteries of medieval memory remind us of the extraordinary capacities of the human mind. Eleanor's court, which seemed so constrained, now reveals itself as a complex system for managing power and responsibility. The medieval world, seen from the comfortable perspective of historical distance, offers us not a challenge to our modern assumptions, but a gentle reminder of the many ways that human beings have found to create meaning, community, and beauty under the most varied circumstances. It suggests that resilience and adaptability are not just survival skills, but sources of dignity and hope. As sleep approaches, let the medieval world fade not into darkness, but into the warm glow of historical understanding. Let the voices of Geoffrey and Eleanor, of village farmers and learned monks, of millers and craftsmen and noble ladies, join the quiet chorus of all who have lived and worked and loved before us. Their world, so different from ours, was also fundamentally human, shaped by the same hopes and fears, the same need for community and meaning that shape our own lives. The gentle distance of centuries transforms the medieval world from a place of foreign challenge into a source of quiet inspiration. In their patient endurance, their careful cultivation of skills and relationships, their ability to find beauty and meaning in lives that were often difficult and uncertain, medieval people offer us a model not of what we should return to, but of what human beings can achieve when they commit themselves to the patient work of building a world together. Rest now in the knowledge that you are part of this long human story, connected across the centuries to all who have faced the challenge of creating lives of meaning and dignity. The medieval world, with its mill wheels and memory palaces, its village dawns and castle halls, becomes not a foreign country but a chapter in the ongoing human story of which you are a part. Let the gentle rhythm of your breathing join the ancient rhythms of seasons and stars, of work and rest, of community and solitude, that have marked human life across the centuries. In the quiet space between sleeping and waking, between past and present, between the medieval world and your own, find the peace that comes from understanding your place in the long, patient story of human endurance and hope. The medieval world fades into the comfortable darkness of historical distance, but its lessons remain. That human beings can adapt to any circumstances, that community and individual survival are inseparable, that knowledge and skill are treasures worth preserving, and that every age, no matter how different from our own, is shaped by the same fundamental human needs for safety, meaning, and connection. Sleep now, gentle traveler through time, and let the whispers of the medieval world fade into the deeper silence of rest and renewal.